My name is John Gatta. I'm the CEO of ECRA Group. In addition to my role at ECRA Group, I am a associate professor of research at Northwestern University in Chicago. My career has sort of been always half academic, half entrepreneur, in that I've always been involved in universities and teaching of analytics and the application of analytics to various sectors, specifically education and healthcare. And then my role as CEO of ECRA Group is really to bring all of these models that originate in universities and translate them into practices for educators. And so that's really what we're here to do today, is talk about some of the advancements that are happening with respect to analytics and how we can use more advanced analytics, specifically predictive analytics, to build more sophisticated early warning systems, and then to use those early warning systems to help accomplish a variety of needs and functions that school personnel have. And so with that, let's dive right in. So we got to start with talking about what a student early warning system is. And so I have a little definition here that we're going to go through to sort of get you acclimated to what we mean by a student early warning system. And so a student early warning system predicts the likelihood of an individual student meeting a predefined success indicator in the future and provides information to monitor the effectiveness of programs and interventions to ensure all students reach their full potential. So I want to dissect this definition a little bit, because there's a couple of pieces of this definition that are fundamental to internalizing what we really mean by an early warning system, and then how we can apply that system to various other functions within a school setting. And so, the first piece of this is that an early warning system predicts. So inherently, when we're talking about early warning systems, we're talking about being able to identify early, now, or based on information that we know currently, that we've accumulated from the past, what is likely to transcribe in the future. So, in the past, student early warning systems have run on sort of other definitions as well, or other semantics. I mean, you may have heard student risk models. Healthcare uses risk models as sort of a synonymous way of talking about this idea of what do we know today that can predict the likelihood of something happening in the future so that we can intervene. And that's really the whole idea, is why do we need to wait in order for a student to not meet a predefined success indicator in the future? We probably know now whether they're on a path to meet that or not. And so that inherently we're talking about prediction. But we're also talking about predefined success indicators. So in order to use predictive models effective for early warning systems, you do have to have an idea in terms of what are the outcomes that we're trying to predict, right? Because in order to build a prediction model to identify students, a year early, 2 years early, 3 years early, whatever it is that we're trying to do, we have to predefine what that success indicator means in the future. So is that proficiency on state exams? Is that proficiency on local exams? Is that attendance? Is that dropout rate, right? These are all examples of predefined indicators that we have to articulate if we're really going to make this come to life. And so that's the first piece of it, this identification piece. But then the second piece is the reason why we want to identify students earlier on is so that we can take action. It's a very action-oriented framework. Because instead of looking retrospectively like we used to in the past in terms of thinking about what has happened and how we can get better in the future, it's much more empowering to talk about if we can identify students earlier in a way that we can intervene before the outcomes manifest, then it's a much more empowering framework. And so the second piece of this is that early warning systems are a very effective way to make sure that you can monitor the effectiveness of your programs and interventions, so that when you do make decisions about students, you're monitoring them in a way that make sure that they're benefiting and that you have a better understanding of effectiveness. And so how do we actually do this, in practice? This is really high level. This is not a technical presentation. After this presentation, if there's interest in a more technical presentation, I'm happy to do that. But this is going to stay pretty 30,000 feet conceptually, and then we're going to talk specifically through examples of how this works in practice. But how do we develop a student early warning prediction model? Because that's really the way we develop a broader system is by first developing a model. And the model is, how can we identify identify which students are at risk of not meeting predefined milestones into the future. And so generally speaking, this is how all prediction model or training model works. And this is the same idea as even a ChatGPT or anything like that, is that we have data, right, that we have to start with, training data. And that means that we have some data set, and that those data sets can come from a lot of places. They can come locally within your district. They could come nationally or state, depending on, if you represent a state department on this call, this could be statewide data sets. If you represent a local school district, this could be local school district data. But the idea here is we can use the data that we've been collecting on students in the past to assemble a data to essentially train a prediction model that we can use to generate future-oriented predictions and probabilities on the events that we're interested in. And so, if we want to predict whether students are on track to meet certain proficiency or growth rates in the future, well, we can look at historical data and we can let the model determine, which students are on track and which students are on track. One of the most efficient things about this kind of an approach is, how many of you in the past have sat around rooms within your school system talking about like where you should draw the line in the sand on a particular assessment, or where you should set a benchmark for, attendance, or where you should, set an appropriate benchmark for social emotional learning indicators, right? The great part about letting the data and the model do the work is that you don't have to make these decisions anymore. You don't have to decide, is it the 25th national percentile where a student gets referred to for intervention? But the best part about this is the models will determine for themselves based off the data, right? Which students are on track and which students are on track. So it's a great way to just systematize more evidence-based practice without having to have these sometimes unproductive conversations of, what can we do in terms of establishing cut scores that we think will predict the future. And so the nice thing is all of this information gets sort of put into individual probabilities of students. And so one of the things that I like to do, and those of you that have heard me speak before, is think about what this looks like in other industries before we dive into education. And so I do a lot of work, obviously, in education, but I also do a ton of work in healthcare, and I also do more, just research in terms of, how these models apply to various industries. And so there's two examples I want to get because they give a little bit different flavor of how these models actually work. So the first one is weather predictions, right? We all, how many of us wake up every morning, we look at our weather app, right? And what do? We scroll down and we see, like, what is the probability that it's going to rain today, right? How many of us do that, right? Ton. At least I do. The important thing to understand about this is there is a whole lot of data, individual data elements that go into that calculation, right? There's barometric pressure, there's cloud cover, there's dew point, there's a whole bunch of sensor data that's collected, right? But how do these models actually work? Well, they've collected data sets in the past based off of all these individual data elements, and then they've kept track of whether it rained or not, rate-based. And they've done exactly what I put on the previous slide. They just let the model determine what combination of data elements leads to which probabilities of it raining. And so the best part about these probabilities is it has all of that information baked into a single number. You don't have to look at barometric pressure or cloud cover or all these weather diagnostics and try to understand what they mean. All you need to know is all of it combined means that there's a 17% chance it's going to rain, right? Or there's a 55% chance it's going to rain. And then that's much more actionable because, if you have a better idea if it's going to rain or not, you can plan your day and you can go on accordingly. And it's a much more action-oriented framework. The other example that I like to give is in healthcare, and this is from CMS. And for those of you that don't know, CMS is essentially the government agency that processes all Medicare and Medicaid services and claims and sort of sees quality of hospitals. And so there's this idea of risk-adjusted outcomes in CMS. And so when they look at the quality of healthcare provided by schools or by hospitals across the country, they don't just look at the indicators. And there's a whole lot of quality indicators that they look at. They look at like 30-day readmittance rates. They look at infection rates. They look at all kinds of metrics, right? But just like in education, like they don't just look at like what percentage of patients were readmitted after discharge within 30 days, right? What they actually do is they use predictive models exactly the way that was described here to assign each and every patient that left the hospital a probability that they would return based off of their own factors, community factors. What we know in healthcare, which is true in education, is that in healthcare there's a lot of social determinants of health, comorbidities, risk factors, right, that play in to the likelihood that you're going to be readmitted within 30 days. Just like in education, there are demographics and other variables that play into the likelihood or interfere in a way with the likelihood of students to perform well on a series of outcomes. And so they look at things from the standpoint of what did we observe against what we expected to observe. And so this idea of sort of risk adjusting our outcomes to have a better understanding of what's working and what's not working is a byproduct of these prediction and early warning systems that make a whole lot of sense. I'm going to show you how that works. And so from a more mechanical standpoint, the way in which this works is think about these models as first starting with a funnel, and I'm going to call those predictors. These are all of the pieces of information that you're collecting on students that you believe should impact or probably are related to the likelihood that they're going to meet certain success milestones in the future, right? So those could be variables like attendance, those could be variables like SEL indicators, those could be variables like performance on state tests, performance on local tests. But there's data that you're collecting on individual students, right, that should inform the likelihood of them meeting milestones in the future. And the way that this works is the model learns from all of these data, and it creates a prediction index. In the example we're doing today, ECRA calls this a propensity score. But then they can use that to project out into the future the likelihood that a student's going to meet certain milestones, and then they can follow the student to see where the actual student performed. And now you have a way of not only projecting and being able to intervene earlier for a student because you know the learning trajectory that they're on. But as you follow them, as you take action on the students, as you identify students, through an early warning system that might benefit from a particular program and intervention, you're able to put together a robust monitoring system by looking at the projected trajectory of a student from the model against the actual trajectory that you're observing, right? And every checkpoint along the way express that as an effect size that captures this difference between where students were projected to be and where they actually ended up. And then we can create some thresholds with that to create actions from those to make sure that we're systematizing our early warning system. And that's really the goal here, is how do we take policy, whether it's state policy, a local district policy, or practices at a building level, or even practices at a classroom level, and how do we systematize that in a way that it just becomes the way of doing business, and we are aligned and are engaged in more evidence-based practices because we're operating under a scientific framework like this. And that was the conceptual piece, but when you look at this in terms of individual student data, and when you actually run data through these models, it's exactly what comes out. And this is just a tiny little example of this, of where you would essentially have a prediction model, an early warning model that was built off of your local district data. And then just like that diagram around the propensity leading to projections and actual results, you can see here that the model is going to take all of the information, and you could have 5, 6, 7, 10 indicators, right? Risk factors, if you will, that you believe are related to a student being able to meet certain milestones in the future. It's going to distill that into this prediction index called a propensity, and then it's going to use that to make projections for individual students in terms of where we're projecting they're going to be a year from now, 2 years from now, whatever it is the outcomes that you're interested in. Then we can look at what they're, where they actually ended up. But just like the weather example, what falls out of these early warning system models are probabilities. And so if you say, like, we want to make sure that we understand every student that has less than 25% chance of meeting some indicator, what's going to fall out of these models are those probabilities. And so just like with the weather example, you don't have to go back to all the individual data elements. You don't have to go outside and look at how, what's the cloud cover, right? Is the temperature dropping? What's the barometric pressure? You don't need to deal with any of that. You only have to deal with interacting with the probabilities. And the same is true with early warning systems, and the use of predictive analytics for early warning systems is that you can focus on these projections and you can focus on these probabilities and feel comfortable that all the information amongst all those individual data elements is already baked into that, right? And then as you take action on students and you put them into programs or interventions or other support mechanisms, you can continue to monitor them along the way to ensure that, because again, early warning system, this is a system, right? So the idea here is the system is about identifying, but the system is also about taking action. And when you take action, you want to continue to monitor. But these models allow you to have a very robust way of monitoring at each interval of data, whether or not the student is on trend with their projections or whether they're outperforming their projections. And we want students to outperform their projections, right, if they're to sort of change the trajectory that they're on and have a higher probability of meeting milestones into the future. So let's put this all to work. Let's go through an example of how this actually works in practice and visually how this is represented in charts and graphs, and then we can open it up for questions and commentary and those things. So the process that I've been alluding to throughout this presentation so far is this idea of an early warning system is about identifying students, taking action, and evaluating impact, and then just rinse and repeating over and over and over again. Right. So the identify students piece is the piece of using the predictive models, right, to establish projections and establish probabilities, and then having the dialogue amongst educators and even, drafting policy and practices amongst, at what point do we need to identify a student or intervene because we don't like the trajectory that they're on, the trajectory that the model is producing. So this first chevron is about identifying students and identifying by interacting with future projections. But the second piece of the early warning system is really around taking the action. Once we've identified students, we want to do something different, because if we don't do anything different, why would we expect the outcomes to change, right? And so I've been doing this a long time, and I can tell you that what I see over and over and over again is that students end up, a lot of times meeting their projections, based off of the model. And a lot of times educators say, they're unhappy with those results. But then when you dig into it and you really press them to say, well, what actions did you take that were different, right? That's sometimes where these early warning systems don't get implemented, to the degree that they should, because if the conditions of the student were the same after they were identified than when they were before identified, you really have a control group versus a control group. So you really wouldn't expect those outcomes to change. So there is sort of a fundamental piece here, is that in order to change future trajectories, you have to change present practices, right? There's just no way around altering the future without changing the present practices and how you're serving students. And so then once we take action, then we're in a position to evaluate the impact of how we took action on students so that we can identify what's moving the needle for students, what's not moving the needle for students, so we can continue to invest in the programs, the interventions, the policies that are actually showing evidence of efficacy, and that we can start backing off on, interventions, programs, policies that just are not moving the needle. So for today, our example is going to be, and again, you could come up with an infinite number of examples, and so this is a nice clean example for the sake of today. But really, when you think about this example, you should be thinking of any scenario in which you have a predefined outcome that you're interested in, and you want to be able to identify students earlier on who's not on track to meet that milestone. All right. But today we're going to look at predicting individual student proficiency rates using the following: prior academic proficiency, prior academic growth, SEL indicators, and attendance. So basically, these indicators that we've been collecting on students, how does it all combine to give us better visibility into, is this student on track to meet, let's say state level proficiencies, a year from now? And so I'm going to demonstrate this using our ECRA School Intelligence platform, which allows me to make a lot of these concepts come to life, in real world applications. And I'm going to demonstrate this using our school improvement application and our document library, which batch processes a variety of reports, from these kinds of models. So let's look first at the identify students piece. That's where we want to start, right? That's where this process starts. So we have a model, right? And we've trained a model. And so how do we use that model to identify students? Well, the key there is, just like the weather, I keep coming back to this weather example because I think it's so intuitive, is the idea there is focus on the projections. right? So the mindset that's different with early warning systems built off predictive models is you're no longer talking about the values that you know about students. You're talking about what the values you know mean about the likelihood of values in the future. But you're better off interacting with the future projections because all of the information, if you have 10 indicators, instead of trying to understand which indicators are good and which indicators are bad in terms of what you have access to today, let the model do its work and just focus on the future-oriented projections. When you do that, I'm going to jump into the platform to actually show you how this works. So now you're actually looking at a real chart which took all those variables into account. That propensity score that we talked about, which combines all those different pieces. It could combine proficiency rates, growth rates, SEL indicators, attendance, whatever it is, that the model used to build itself. In this scenario, we're looking at a state test on the y-axis, and we're looking at this propensity on the x-axis. The green line represents the proficiency that we have determined. This happens to be a state standard for this example, right? The state standard for where students are likely to end up a year from now, right? So what you see here is every single dot represents a student, right? And so as I hover over these dots, right, you can see that all of these kids, if I were to go down here and just say, give me all of the kids, right, whose projections are to fall short of the standard. So see what I did there is I clicked on a box and I filtered, identify for me all of the students, right, who are projected not to meet the standard a year from now, right? Now, the thing is, every student has a probability. So as you hover over these dots, you can see that, this particular student has a 47% chance. This particular student has a 31% chance. This particular student has 11% chance. Again, going back to that weather example, is it takes into account all of that information, right? But it projects out into the future in terms of the trajectory that individual students are on. Once you use this to identify, students that are not on track to meet the milestones that you want, you can create groups. You can tag these students, right, so that I'm going to take action on these group of kids, right? But then at every iteration in the future, I'm going to come back to this group of students and I'm going to see where they are in relevance to these projections, right? And so what you're going to see in another example is once we know what the actual values are, these dots, no pun intended, are going to scatter, right? Because once we know where students are actually at, we're going to have a projected score, which we have today. We're going to have an actual score, and then we're going to be able to do some of that interaction that I had talked about. The other great way of interacting with these kinds of projections is, so right now I've highlighted all of the ones who are projected not to meet standards. But then you could look further into that. You could ask, well, how many of these students have IEPs, for example? Like, can we target some of these through the IEP students? So this will give you all IEP students that are projected not to meet the standard a year from now, right? If you wanted to know a particular, like, which buildings are these, from, you could ask, like, which, how many of these students are in building A versus building B? Again, this idea of understanding where these students are. But the nice thing about using a framework like this is you can also batch process some reports for you to do this work for you. And so once you have the projections, it becomes very easy then to see, well, just show me by grade level, how many students are projected to meet standards. Show me that by building. Show me that by grade level. Show me that by subject area. Show me that by subgroup, right? Any data that you're keeping track of, once you know at an individual student level where their personalized projection is, it becomes a very easy thing to do to then say, well, just give me the projections for all the different groups that I care about, right? So I can work at the individual student level to take action, and that's particularly the case when you're talking about, within a classroom taking action, or even within a building level and a grade level. As you get to a district level or a state level, right? The taking action is really about understanding groups of kids and where they are, so that you can attack things more from a policy standpoint. And so the nice thing about this is that you end up moving towards what we call projection-based goal setting. So how many of you have every year, it's pretty much right around this time of year, it's goal setting season right now, are sitting around the table for different groups of students, whether they're buildings, whether they're grade levels, whether they're different, student groups, trying to determine what the goal for the year is, right? The goal is to increase reading by 5% in third grade or whatever it is, right? The great thing about an early warning system that uses predictive modeling is the goals are set for you. You don't ever have to set goals anymore because the model's setting the goal for you. And so that's what you're seeing here is that, if you wanted to know what a particular goal for any group of students is, just read it off the report. You got to beat the model. So you got to beat 32%, you got to beat 50%. And you could look that up for any building, any grade level, any building by grade level combination, any subgroup combination for any conceivable group of kids that you can identify. The model will generate the goal for you through the projections. And so that's a nice action-oriented framework that allows you to focus on intervening and helping and programming and implementation, and focus less on just trying to understand the data and get your head around the data. And so, I've seen this work, incredibly well in practice. But so now that we've identified students, now what does the take action piece look like? And, from a larger standpoint, take action is really about matching students to programs, and interventions from a conceptual standpoint. So what do we know about students to be able to do that? But I'm sure there are people on this call that represent school districts at various levels of grain, if you will. And so, take action at the State Department level looks very different than take action at sort of, let's say, the teacher level here. So let's talk a little bit about, and again, these are just examples. You could come up with lots of different ways that you might intervene when you've identified students, again, that are not on a trajectory to meet milestones in the futures. But at a State Department level, this looks a lot like resource allocation, right? It looks a lot like understanding from a state level, where these pockets are, and making sure that resources are allocated appropriately. It looks like a lot of informing of policy, because, if you run this kind of a framework at a state level, you will have visibility into state performance across the state like you have never had before. The visibility that you will have in terms of like which parts of the state need certain kinds of programs and interventions, and whether you're talking about federal programs or whether you're talking about state level programs or whether you're talking about other grants that are available for certain kinds of districts, the visibility that you get from operating under a framework like this just allows you to allocate resources much more effectively. And the final thing it allows you to do is it allows you to implement, I mentioned this in the healthcare example, it allows you to implement this idea of risk-adjusted school accountability, because it allows you to be a little bit more refined about, instead of just comparing all students to schools to a common standard, you can compare all schools, right, where they performed against sort of where a risk-adjusted benchmark said they should perform. And so this idea of risk-adjusted school accountability is a great byproduct of a framework like this. At the district level, you're talking a lot about MTSS design, multi-tiered systems of support. And so when you think about it at the district level, you have to think much more macro about how do you architect your programs, how do you architect your interventions, and how do you operationalize local policy that comes from, this is the district policy for when and how we identify students, right? And how we get them referred to, appropriate supports. That's about architecting your MTSS and operationalizing policy. But at a district level, it's also about this concept of academic return on investment or program evaluation, because as you implement these local practices and as you serve students differently across the students, so long as you can keep track of how students are being served, right, then you can come back and ask really important questions about what programs, interventions, policies actually provided some academic return on investment and which ones didn't. And so it's a really powerful that way. At the building level, the school leaders, you make decisions every day about, which students should get certain kinds of interventions. A framework like this will be able to quantify and provide evidence in terms of which interventions are working, which interventions aren't working. And you'll be able to better match students to the appropriate intervention and monitor those. It will certainly help with MTSS implementation because, again, you'll have a more robust framework to align your practices to. And so things will seem a lot more organized, they'll seem a lot more scientific, and they'll definitely be more evidence-based. And certainly school leaders are in large part interested in developing teachers, right? The professional development of teachers and making sure that we not only evaluate teachers, but we really help them develop and become better teachers. And so, as you can imagine, just like you can look at sort of risk-adjusted school accountability, if you will, you can look at sort of which teachers are really moving the needle for students in certain areas, which teachers aren't. So you can create professional development, you can create professional learning communities, you can have better visibility into how to connect teachers with admin and other professional development opportunities to ensure that you have growth and that everybody's getting better and better each and every year. And then finally, within the classroom level, the teachers, what does action look like? It looks in part like action research. Teachers make decisions every day about new innovative practices that they want to try. What they don't have is the tools to say, I tried a particular instructional modality with this group of kids this year. I want to know if it actually worked. Right. And so this provides teachers and empowers teachers to, as they innovate through action research, to be a little bit more disciplined about looking at not only what I did differently, but did that actually manifest itself in improved outcomes. This framework allows for a very easy way to do that. Certainly it allows you to personalize the learning opportunities for students, because when you have that kind of visibility into the students and where they're headed, you're in a better position to personalize, and it provides better information for targeted intervention referral. And so that this idea is, a lot of times, in schools, it's really the teacher within the classroom that identifies a student and what they may or may not need, and this just provides more evidence, to support those decisions. So we've identified students, we've taken action. Actions mean different things, whether you're at a State Department level, a district level, a school level, or a classroom level, but now it's time to evaluate the impact. So now we've made decisions about students. How do we evaluate the impact? Well, the great thing about a framework like this is we have projections, right? We have actual values, right? We can express that difference as an effect size. And so many of you are now probably familiar with, effect sizes through lots of published works, but effect sizes are a great way to determine when something is meaningful and when something is not meaningful. And you can establish thresholds to create sort of these impact categories so that you can take action. And so, for this example, we're using any effect size that's 0.3 or above that is higher than expected, so it's really working. It's outperforming the model. Effect sizes from -0.3 to 0.3 as expected. Then a degree of lower than expected and a degree of unsatisfactory. And by unsatisfactory, what we really mean is situations in which kids are radically underperforming what the model projected, which means they probably would have been better off without the intervention of the program. And so when we do that, again, that first chart that you saw, all those dots were lined up in the middle, right? But now we know where students actually performed. And again, I'm gonna hop in and kind of show you this at work here. Is now you're looking at a graph in which the model projected where they were going to be maybe 3 months ago, 6 months ago, 9 months ago, a year, whatever we're looking at this, right? But now we know what the actual values are. That green line still represents the state proficiency standard like we talked about, right? But the blue lines reflect sort of the predicted range of where we expect kids to lie, right, in terms of if they were on track with their model. So if I was to say, show me all of the students that sort of met their projections, you're going to get everybody in between these blue lines. So these are students that are really keeping pace with their projections. So these are students that are basically tracking with the model, if you will, right? If I was to say, show me those that have low, these are students that are underperformed the model. Now, the interesting thing to notice about this and the way this framework works is, so these students are all students that have underperformed their personalized projections. So these are students that really should have done better, right? But what you'll notice is that these are, again, all different kinds of students. You have some students, right, who are still above the proficiency standard, but didn't perform as well as they should. So I could get more granular with this, and I could say, well, show me the kids that really did meet the standard, but didn't do as well as they should. right? That's these students, right? Consequently, I could say, well, no, just give me the ones that underperformed where they should have against their own personalized projection, but also were below the standard, right? I could get even more granular to say, show me all of the ones that had a low prediction index, what we're calling propensity. These are all the most at-risk kids in the district, okay? And when I talked about this idea of identify students, take action, evaluate impact, we're evaluating impact now, but we are also starting the identification process all over again, because we are asking the question of, now that we've identified them for projections, we've put them into a program of intervention, now that we know it's not working for these students, what do we need to do, right? And there's other tools that are available to you. Let's say you've identified it, these are all students that really have not met their full potential here, at least as their underperformance against the model. There are other tools that you can use to sort of profile these students to have a better understanding of what are some of the standards they're doing well on, what are some of the standards that they're not doing well on, what buildings are they a part of, right? What subgroups or student groups are they a part of, what programs are they participating in? So you can get this, again, you get this, the idea that it's all about identify, take action, and evaluate impact, and then generate insights from the groups of students that you're identifying so that you can continue to refine sort of these interventions and programs that you're using with students. And so when you repeat that over and over again, you can then run reports that look at, so is there any systematic over or underperformance by building? Is there any systematic under or over performance by program? And so this concept of academic return on investment plays right into a framework like this, because you can actually look at which programs are moving the needle and which ones aren't. And again, if I were to hop back into the platform as a demonstration here, is if you were keeping track of all the different interventions and programs, right? And even you may have gone as far as for certain kinds of programming to add additional information like expenditures and funding source, and identify which outcomes you're trying to impact as a result of that, then you can generate reports for board reporting, for grant reporting, for a variety of different outlets to say, like, how did these particular programs perform? And it will do an analysis of those programs. And again, all built off this early warning system, all built off of this risk model of saying, where were students likely to be in these programs? Where did they end up? And then it will give a comprehensive analysis for you. It'll, sort of explain that methodology, say, well, here's the 5 programs that we, or 4 programs we evaluated this year. Here was the number of students we served. This was the financial allocation. And this is that ROI, that return on investment effect size. And then a comprehensive analysis of each one of those programs. We have a lot of clients that take this kind of report and they just stick it in a board packet, or they stick it in a grant, some sort of grant reporting that they have to do. And if you get in the habit of just letting the models do their work and then concentrate on keeping track of how students are serving, evaluating every program every year as just a way of doing business becomes a reality. It just automatically happens, right? Every program, every intervention, everything gets evaluated every year as just a way of doing business. And that over time is a much more evidence-based practice, and over time you will see better student outcomes through that kind of a continuous quality improvement cycle. But then, as you can imagine, you can run these by grade levels, you can run these by interventions, right? You can run these by student groups, and just right away not have to dig into all of the minutia of all the different data. The model's doing the work for you, and essentially layering a decision-making framework on top of that to say, these are blue, these are blue interventions, these are green interventions, these are yellow interventions, right? And of course, then you could also generate these kinds of reports by classroom too, and teachers. So if you're trying to identify like which teachers are really moving the needle in math, which teachers are really moving the needle in English language arts, you could even give teachers access to these models so that as they engage in sort of differentiation of personalization within the classroom, they have the opportunity to say, is it working, right? And so I hope you get a sense of how this just sort of repeats over and over and over again.